Continuing on Masech and Hilchot Kriyat Shema, Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, Siman, Samech, Gimal, and we are on Seif Zayin. The Shulchan Aruch says, Haya osek b'melacha v'ratzah likrot Kriyat Shema. If you're doing your work, you're working, and now it's time for Shema, you want to say Shema, yitbatel mimelachto ad sheikra parasha rishona. You should stop working until you finish the first parasha of Shema. That means up until Vehaya. And then you could continue your work while saying the rest of Shema. And the reason for that is shelo yehe kekore arai. They should not be like a person that is reading it arai, not with focus and just is something on the side, temporary thing that you're doing. The Mishna Berurah writes, it is clear from the Shulchan Aruch that from Vehaya and on, you could be doing your work while saying Shema. Afilu bebrachot Kriyat Shema. You could even be saying the brachot of Kriyat Shema while, so to speak, working. Now, how about if you're writing, right? Now, so you want to write, but writing takes a lot of focus out of a person because your mind should be completely working when it's not just a physical thing that you're driving or you're picking up something from point A, putting it in point B. Writing, it drains the focus of a person completely because it's the mind and hand correlation of a thought brought to action. So Chacham Ovadia writes that even when you're writing, it's the same thing that when you work, you don't need to stop it. Only when you say Parashat Rishonah, and not even the brachot. And you see the same thing. Chacham Ovadia says that the writing is the halakha of other works. It's the same thing. You could be writing after the first parasha, because writing is not like dibur. Some want to say that writing is like speech. Actually, it's a very interesting raya from next week's parasha, from the Ramban. The Ramban asks the question when it says, Vayomer Yitro, Yitro, when he comes to see Moshe Rabbeinu, says, Vayomer Yitro, says, Yitro said to Moshe, I am your father-in-law, Yitro, coming to you. So Ramban asks a series of questions. How did he say it to him? He's not there. It's not a Shaliach. He proves. So how do he says he wrote it? He sent a letter. And the language, the verbiage the Torah uses for that is what? Vayomer Yitro. He said, so some want to say it's a cute attempt to prove that Ktiva, writing, is like dibur, like saying. But halachically speaking, we paskin that Ktiva, writing, is not like saying, and therefore, says Chacham Ovadia, you could even be writing as you say Shema. Okay, this is Yebiyahu Merichelek Tet, and says the Mishna Berurah that even in Kriyat Shema's brachot, the brachot prior, the brachot afterwards, you could be working and saying the bracha. And Chacham Ovadia also agrees with that same thing. But Kaf HaChaim says that by brachot, you cannot be working. Brachot, you have to stop, pause, and say the brachot properly, as we had by other brachot prior. And he has a question over here, which we're not going to get into the details of, but Maran writes in Seif Chet, ha'umanin, workers, vechen ba'al habayit, and same is with the employer, she'ayu osim melacha, that they are working, berosh ha'ilan, on top of a tree. Let's imagine you have a field and they have to go on top of the tree to pick the fruits or to prune the things. So people are on the tree working. Or berosh shurot habinyan, or they're building a wall and they're on top of the wall, making the next layer, laying bricks on top of the wall. You don't have to come down for saying Shema. Meaning, the argument that would be made is, well, when you're on top of the wall, how much kavanah can you have? You're afraid you're going to fall down. You're on top of a tree. It's pretty scary. So maybe you should come down to say Shema. The halakha is you don't have to come down. You could stay on top of the wall, stay on top of the tree, and say Shema. That is fine. They don't have to come down. Now, when we will get to the halachot of tefillah, you'll see that perhaps is different. But for Shema, they don't need to change their stats. They don't need to change their place. Says Maran in Seif Tet, Hakataf, Afal Pishe Masao al Ketefo, a person whose job is to carry items from point A to point B, and he has something on his back, on his shoulder, he's carrying something, and time comes for Shema. Korek Kriyat Shema, even though that he has his load on his back, he could, while having the load on his back, he could say Shema, but he shouldn't start Shema when you are putting the load on, and not in the moment that you are putting the load down. Those times need more focus, and you can't really be saying Shema when you're doing that. But while carrying it, when he's already properly, safely put on you, and you're walking, that's fine. You don't have to unload yourself and stand there or sit there and say Shema. You could do it as you're working. And the reason you shouldn't do it when you are putting the load on or taking it off is because at that moment, you're completely focused on doing your job properly to unload or load, and therefore your heart is not with you really. You don't have the proper yeshuv adat needed for saying Shema. And even if the load is large, says the Mishna Berurah, which is more than arba kabin, that for tefillah, later on we'll see that is asur. Later on in Siman Sadizayin, the Shkaruch will say that if you have a load on you and you want to daven, you cannot if it's a large load. Sometimes you can have large loads. Nowadays, it's less shachiach, but to have a large backpack and so on and so forth will probably be applicable for the soldiers who have 120 pounds of gear on their back, and the backpack or whatever you want to call it. So sometimes it will be there, but that's for tefillah. For Shema, it's mutar. Even if it's a large load of arba kabin, still will be fine. So the one thing just to mention on this note, that the difference between tefillah and Shema, the Kaf HaChaim writes that by tefillah, the kavanah is ma'akev. By Shema, kavanah is not ma'akev. We said the first pasuk is important, right? And after the first pasuk, if you didn't have that kavanah, it's fine. But tefillah, the entire thing, you're standing in front of King, and it's not something that you could just, be troubled with the load on your back, and so on and so forth. You're not supposed to hold something in your hand that may fall and break, for instance, right? Or something that's distracting you. It becomes a whole question. If nowadays, we'll discuss this when we get there, if nowadays it's mutar for you to daven from your smartphone, when you have an app for tefillah and you want to daven, or you Google online, get a nusach of tefillah, and you want to daven from it, you don't have a sidur or so now if you have no choice, that's one thing. But if you could say it Baal Peh, and you look into the phone, because you have sometimes you could have a problem by notifications coming up, right, which is distracting. And also the phone itself, if it falls, it will break. So you're not supposed to hold something in your hand that could fall and could break. So halachically speaking, there's certainly much room to be lenient, but that's something that we will discuss later in Tefillah. Nevertheless, that's what the Kaf HaChaim says the difference is between Shema and Tefillah. By Tefillah, you need to have a situation that you have kavarah throughout the whole thing. Well, Shema, you don't have that after first pasuk, therefore, hence the difference. Now, let's start the next Siman Samech Dalet. What do you do if you make a mistake in Shema? So says Maran, and this is really in Gemara. We had this in Mishnah in Brachot in Gemara there in Daf Tetvav Amud Aleph. Kera'ah lemafreya lo yatsa. If you read Shema backwards, you're not yotze. What does backwards mean? Beseder ha'pesukim, in the order of the pesukim. Aval im iktim parasha lechaverta. But if you changed the order of parashiyot, that means you did the third parasha second, and so on and so forth. But the order of pesukim in every one of the parashiyot, of the three parashiyot of Shema, you said properly, says Maran, Af, Al Pi She'eino Rashai, even though that's asur to do that, you're not allowed to do that. But if you did it, then Yatsa. Lefi She'ena Smucha Lah B'Torah. Because in the order of the Torah, even though that we do it in order, but they're not next to each other in the Torah. Now each one of them is in a different place, in three different places in the Chumash. Therefore, if you did the order backwards or out of order, that's fine. But halachically speaking, l'chatchila, it's asur to do that. You're not supposed to do that. It says the Mishna Berurah, the Chafetz Chaim, yatsa shenemar v'ayu ha'devarim ha'ele. This that you're not yotze if you don't say the parasha in order is because it says vehayu, and the Gemara darshins behabayatan yihu, that they should be in the way they're mentioned in the Torah. That's the way you should say them. If you say them out of that order, you're not yotze. So therefore, if you say the second pasuk of Shema first, and then the second, you say the first pasuk second, you're not yotze. Ve'af parashat vayomer, even parasha of vayomer, when Chazal were metaken, we mentioned before that parasha vayomer we say only because, and it's the Oraita, it's an important parasha, but not because of Shema necessarily, but because of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the mention of Exodus of us coming out of Mitzrayim, Leman tizkor yom setcha be'eretz Mitzrayim, kol yemei chayecha. That's one mitzvah, and also we mentioned it's because of Parashat Tzitzit, right? So they instituted that this third parasha Vayomer is also going to be said in Shema. But when Chazal made that institution, rabbinic institution, is because of Zechirat Yetziat Mitzrayim. But nevertheless, once it's part of Shema, it follows rabbinically all of those halachot that Shema has. So you have this interesting creation of halacha that even though that when the Gemara says v'hayu v'havayatan yehu, that's only in the parasha of Shema. Parasha of Vayomer is not v'hayu, and nevertheless you have this halacha that if you say it backwards, even in Parashat Vayomer, you will have to go back and say it again. You're not yotze. Why? So says the Mishna Berurah, because when they made the rabbinic institution of saying Shema with three parashiot, all of the three parashiot maintain the same halachic restrictions, and therefore, if you changed the order, even by the third parasha, you would be in trouble. Now says, let's just finish this Seif. V'kol shken im seres et hatevot, and of course not only psukim, but if you change the order of the words in the same pasuk, that of course will be a problem. Now, meaning not only you said the whole pasuk right, but you change the order of psukim, but you change the words of the pasuk, that for sure will of course be a problem. She'en smucha, the reason for it that you're yotze b'di'evet, if you change the order of the parashiot, you said the first parasha second and so on, is because it's only a takanat chazal that they should be Shema, which means ve'ahavta, and then ve'ayah, then vayomer. That's takana of chazal. And the Gemara says it. The Gemara says in Daf Yud Gimel, they're in Brachot, Lama kadma Shema leVehaya. Why is it that Shema comes before Vehaya? Because it makes sense that way. You first have to accept Hashem's mastery and kingship over the world and your servitude, and then you could accept his mitzvot. If you don't accept him as a king, how are you going to accept him when he gives mitzvot to us, right? And hence, it makes sense only to have the first parasha first. But that's Takarat Chazal. If you changed from it, then it will be still fine. Says the Mechaber Maran in Seif Bet, Chara parasha v'ta'aba. If you read a parasha and you made a mistake, Im yodea hechan ta'a, kegon shkara kulah, ela shedilek pasuk echad be'emsa. If you know what your mistake exactly was, in other words, you know that you read the parasha and you skipped one pasuk. You know that. So then, says the Shulchan Aruch, you go back to that place that you made a mistake. Chozer lerosh oto pasuk. You go to the beginning of that pasuk that you skipped, that you made a mistake in. Ve'gomer parasha, and from there and on, you read in order. So that's helpful because you know where you made a mistake. But if you don't remember where your mistake was, then chozer lerosh parasha. You go to the beginning of that parasha. In other words, you go to the beginning of the pasuk that you know for sure up until then you did well. So if you don't know where in this parasha you made a mistake, but you know the previous parasha you did good, then you go to the beginning of this parasha. But if you know I made a mistake in this pasuk, then there's no reason to go back to the beginning of this parasha. You just go back to the beginning of that pasuk, and from there you continue in order. So says the Hafetz Chaim in Mishna Berurah says, "Katav pri chadash tavkat ha'ah, aval behezid or bemitkaven chozer lerosh." The Chadash says if you made a mistake, that's the halacha. But if you deliberately made a mistake, I'm not sure what the scenario for that would be, then you go to the beginning of the whole thing. Just like we have for tefillah later on in the tefillah Siman Kufidalet, that if you make a mistake in this way, you go back to the beginning of the tefillah. Magen Avraham mistapek bazen. Magen Avraham is not so sure if this would be the halacha. Which on that note, the Kaf HaChaim says that you should go back to the beginning. I mean, Kaf HaChaim takes sides between the Safek of Magen Avraham and the Vadai of Pri Chadash. Kaf HaChaim says, Pri Chadash says you go back to the beginning if you made a deliberate mistake, and that's the halacha. You go back to the beginning. Okay, Pasuk Echad. Just finish this Seif. Ve'im dilek teva achat. If you missed one word, yesh omrim shmazadai sheachzor leoto ateva. Now those who say just go back to that word. Ve'igmor, and then finish it up. Im hu b'makom shematchil inyan b'fnei atzmo. Kegon shetilek mipasuk v'shinantam tevat v'dibarta. For instance, he gives an example. The pasuk says v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam. So imagine if you skip the word v'dibarta, right? You just said v'shinantam levanecha bam. Then you go back to that word. Aval besefer Eliyahu Rabbah says no. If you missed even one word, you have to go back to the beginning of that pasuk, because if you went on with reading by mistake, you changed the meaning of the whole pasuk, and that's considered a messed up pasuk. You can't go back to that place, to the word that you made a mistake. Imagine when you go back after reading the number of pasukim, you go back and you say, "V'dibarta bam b'shiftecha b'vetecha." It's mid-sentence. It doesn't make sense. It says the Eliyahu Rabbah, you go back to the beginning of that pasuk, and of course, as you could guess, Yaakov Chaim Sofer in Kaf HaChaim sides with this psak that you should be machmir, and he says, also if you skip only one letter, forget about one word. Let's imagine he says, "V'shinantam levanecha dibarta bam." Instead of dibarta bam, you skipped the vav. Still, you would have to go back to the beginning of that pasuk. Or even if you didn't miss any of the letters or words, you just mispronounced the word in a way that changes the meaning, right? Which, as we mentioned, examples of it could easily happen if you're not careful. Then you go back to the beginning of that pasuk. You have to, from where you made a mistake, you have to say in order, finishing the entire parasha from that place and on. You can't just go back and read the one pasuk that you made a mistake in. You can't do that. Why? Because if you say only that pasuk, says the Mishna Berurah, that's reading the Shema out of order, backwards, and therefore that's not counting as saying Shema. If you didn't remember that you skipped that pasuk from the first parasha until after you said the second parasha, then you can't say, well, I said the parasha sheniya, everything good, so let me just go back and repeat the first parasha. No. Says the Mishna Berurah, even though the lechatchila you would say is not good enough, because we just said in Mishna Berurah earlier on in the beginning of the Siman that even though that said the parashiyot enu ma'akev, lechatchila you can't do that. Lechatchila you should say the first parasha first, second parasha second, third parasha third. But nevertheless, when they're talking about mistakes being made, you can't say, well, I can't go back and just say the first parasha because the seder of the parashiyot are important. Says the Mishna Berurah, in regards to order of the parashiyot, you don't have to be concerned about it b'di'evet. In other words, if you made a mistake in the first parasha, you remembered it at the end of Shema, when you finished the whole Shema. You have to go to that pasuk in the first parasha and then finish the first parasha, second parasha, and third parasha, or do you just finish the first parasha? Says Mishna Berurah, you don't have to be concerned about the second and third, even though that you would argue not like that, because the chatchila, you should say it in order. The inyan ta'ut, for when it comes to the topic of mistakes, you could just cover the mistake of the first parasha and say the seder parashiyot are not me'akev, and therefore you would be good to go. Last Seif Katan, the Rosh Parasha, Machmat Safek. That's because of Safek. You don't know where you made the mistake. You have to read the whole parasha all over again. Even if it is in the second parasha, according to the Manda Amar, that says the second parasha is the Rabbanan. In other words, we had a machloket, three-way machloket, yesterday in the Mishna Berurah, whether or not only the first pasuk is the Oraita, or maybe the whole first parasha is the Oraita, or maybe the second parasha also is the Oraita. So according to the first two shitot, the second parasha is the Rabbanan. So even if you assume that second parasha is the Rabbanan, still, when you have Safek, maybe you didn't read this pasuk properly, you go back to the beginning of second parasha and you read the whole thing all over again. Says the Mishna Berurah, once you're busy with reading Shema, you should fix everything properly. It really depends. If you remember that you said the first pasuk bekavana, you said the pasuk of Shema bekavana, and you said Baruch Shem also bekavana, then you only go back to V'ahavta. But if you don't remember, even if you said Shema bekavana, then you go back to the very beginning of Shema and you say Shema again. Now, if you know for sure that you said Shema with kavanah, you remember that you said Shema and you said it properly, you just misupak. If you said it with kavanah, you have doubts. If you said it with kavanah, you have to go back to say Shema again also. Only if you know for sure you said it with kavanah, you don't have to go back, because safek d'oraita ala chumrah. And says the Mishna Berurah, once you did not say the the parasha bekavana, it's like as if you didn't read it at all. The pasuk of Shema, if you didn't say Shema bekavana, it's as if you didn't read it, and therefore you have to start from the beginning, not to be lemafreya. So, and as we mentioned before, you either have to wait a little bit or say Shema belachash quietly. They shouldn't be like it's model nishter reshuyot, which is something that we spoke about prior. Bezrat Hashem will continue this halachot in Seif Gimel in the days to come.